Hello and welcome. My name is Victoria and I'm an international trade and customs consultant. On this channel, I discuss topics related to international trade and movement of goods across borders. And today I want to talk about the US dollar's dominance in international trade. As you may know, the United States dollar operates as the world's primary reserve currency. This means that it's a default medium of exchange for international trade. Even if the transactions do not necessarily involve a US buyer or seller, the majority of international trade transactions are still processed in US dollar because of how the system has been set up in the last 80 years. So, as an example, if a business in South Korea purchases goods from a business in Canada, that transaction will almost universally be settled and processed in US dollars. Today, in this video, I want to explore the US dollar's position in international trade, how the structural dominance was achieved, how the United States utilizes its position in the world to enforce global compliance through financial sanctions, and why a growing coalition of nations has, in the last few years, actively attempted to diversify away from the dollar and ensure that trade can actually be processed in other world currencies. So let's dive in. The starting point was in 1944 when there was a Bretton Woods conference where delegates from 44 allied nations met to create a stable financial system that would help the nations rebuild and promote development and cooperation as a sign of peace, stability, and the newfound ideas of friendship. At the time, European economies were essentially exhausted and devastated, whereas the United States were holding about 75% of the world's monetary gold reserves. The resulting Bretton Woods Agreement established a fixed exchange rate system with two core basic principles. The US dollar at the time was directly associated to gold, fixed at exactly $35 per ounce. All other participating currencies of other 43 nations were associated to the dollar, and so the exchange system was established based on that metric. And so that made the dollar essentially the anchor currency at the time. Around 1971, President Nixon has fundamentally changed that system, transitioning the world into a flat currency system, which meant that exchange system has been essentially locked in, where specific commodities like oil, for example, would be exclusively priced in dollars. And because oil, of course, was one of the most important commodities at the time, this has given the dollar the playground to further develop its stance around the world, ensuring that the US dollar could remain as the dominant currency for international trade.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of one international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Just to give you an idea, since then, the US dollar has acquired quite a lot of stance where it comes to transactions being processed through it, by it. Similarly, different institutions were also built up to sustain this system. And so the majority of banks in every single country is fundamentally linked to the banking systems in the United States. Virtually what that means is that the majority of transactions, regardless of where they originate or terminate, must pass through a US clearing bank or the US financial system at some point to be settled. And the moment a transaction touches the US dollar and the US financial system, it fundamentally falls under the US legal jurisdiction. So just to give you an idea in terms of percentages, the US dollar accounts for about 51% of international payments processed through the SWIFT system. The US dollar is involved in nearly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions. The US dollar makes up roughly 56% of allocated global foreign exchange reserves, making it the world's primary reserve currency, and over 60% of world debt is denominated in dollars, and the greenback, which is a colloquial term for dollars, accounts for roughly 54% of global export and import invoicing. And so the mechanics of international banking has been set up in such a way as to give the US an exorbitant privilege. This means that the US also possesses an immense regulatory power and geopolitical leverage by means of application of financial sanctions. So any individual, business, or bank, as well as a country, regardless of their physical location or nationality, can be sanctioned or persecuted by the US government if their transactions involve the US dollar or utilize US financial clearing mechanisms. So for example, if a French bank in Paris facilitates a dollar-denominated transaction for a sanctioned entity or country, let's assume it's a business in Iran, for example, that French bank has violated the US law and can be imposed a financial sanction. This is scary. Why? Because the majority of financial institutions around the world are fundamentally tied to the US financial system and the US financial infrastructure. The US can essentially cut the French bank off from the US financial system entirely, effectively destroying its ability to do international business. If a non-US company located anywhere in the world does business with a sanctioned country, even if they're using the local currency, the US can ban that entity from ever using the US financial systems or doing business with US companies, or implement travel bans, for example. There are other types of sanctions that are primarily focused on export of goods. These are called export controls, as well as control of dual-use items. So here are some examples of the sanctions implemented by the US in the international arena over the years. One of the biggest ones refers to the BNP Paribas in France, which has been sanctioned 8.9 billion in 2014. At the time, the French bank essentially pleaded guilty to systemically concealing and processing billions of dollars in transactions through the US financial system on behalf of entities in countries like Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. There was a Commerzbank in Germany that was sanctioned 1.45 billion in 2015 because it was caught for using what was called deceptive banking practices to clear transactions for blacklisted entities in Iran and Sudan. HSBC Bank in the UK was fined 1.3 billion in 2012, which was actually part of a larger 1.92 billion settlement, accused of moving hundreds of millions of dollars for sanctioned nations like Iran, Libya, and Sudan. Corporate entities that were fined are the Binance Cayman Islands, was fined a total of 4.3 billion in 2023, which is today considered the largest settlement in US Treasury's history, due to facilitation of transactions of countries like Iran, Cuba, and Syria. British American Tobacco, based in the UK, was fined 629 million in 2023 because it was accused of deceiving US banks into processing payments for tobacco sales into North Korea. Then there was the Seagate technology, based in the US and Singapore. It was fined 300 million in 2023, accused of violating export controls by continuing to sell hard disk drives to blacklisted Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Upon a research, it's also possible to find many different cases related to individuals being fined where their assets are simply frozen. But of course, countries find solutions. Just to give you an example, when in 2022, the Russia-Ukraine conflict was started, different foreign businesses were invited to leave Russia because the first step was primarily related to the reputational damage. And so many foreign businesses, instead of leaving Russia completely, have tried to find solutions related to setting up businesses that had a different name, that had different financial structures, and were essentially able to bypass those sanctions. That, of course, does not happen without difficulty, and the more sanctions packages are imposed over time, the more different institutions learn about these different mechanisms that companies, nations, and individuals find to bypass the sanctions, and so they find ways to make that more and more difficult for them. What is important to note is that the aggressive application of sanctions has created friction in the international arena because many countries that may not necessarily agree with the US's strategic objectives, there is danger of falling into the US's bad graces and see themselves completely cut off from the rest of the world because of how interconnected all of these systems are and because of how much control the US has actually managed to acquire over the last few decades. And so, especially after the 2022 Russia-Ukraine conflict, when about 300 billion of Russia's assets were frozen, it was signaled to many different nations around the world that if you're not aligned with the US, holding US reserves holds not only political risk, but almost existential risk. And consequently, the BRICS, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have led a coordinated effort towards de-dollarization. The BRICS were founded in 2009, and today they have more members that include Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia. And BRICS have been somewhat slow to act, but they have engaged in efforts to create a separate financial system from the US and the Western bloc, so to speak, or as the Russians would call it, the collective West. So what does this effort by other nations in creating their own financial system means for the rest of the world and international trade? It means that there are more bilateral clearing systems being created and more bilateral agreements amongst different countries where they develop a parallel payment system that bypasses Western networks like SWIFT, for instance. China has created one. It's called CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. What this means is that there's a reduced sanctions efficiency because as more trade occurs in different currencies outside the dollar system, the less enforcement force there is on the part of the US. So if a transaction never touches a US bank or a US dollar, Washington cannot legally or technically freeze it or impose limitations on its activity. It's important to note that the new systems require quite a lot of work and cooperation amongst the different nations because they need to be working together alongside the different sanctions being imposed by the US. It would be silly of us to assume that the US, having reached such a significant position in the world and having worked so hard into consolidating it, that it would actually give it up so easily. And so the US continuously creates limitations in terms of what these nations can actually do, because the US still continues to be a dominant force. And of course, these different countries, they still try to engage in diplomacy, despite it being clear that it is quite a competitive environment, almost dangerous environment, because the US still holds the power to make it or break it for many different countries, entities, or businesses. The US is capable of essentially bankrupting a country, completely isolating it, or if that doesn't work, promote a military intervention. that to the outside world may sometimes look as those countries own dictatorial internal fights. I think it's important to say that despite how comfortable and cheap the US system has become, the comfort should probably not be considered as the most important thing in our lives. Countries do possess their own sovereignty. Different countries do possess their own strategic interests, and those interests don't have to align with what one nation in the world tends to defend. Additionally, monopolies do not promote healthy competition, where there is constant technological, ideological, and political advancement. And so I do personally defend the existence of different polarities in the world, because in my opinion, it is not healthy to have one nation imposing their will on other countries that can be located thousands of kilometers away. Monopolies, such as this one, do corrupt, and they do start promoting the idea of exclusivity. It is not a healthy thing to display superiority, assuming that no one can do it better, just because the status quo is the way it is. At the moment, there are different examples of countries that are engaging in creating their own systems. These are, of course, Russia. China is expanding its cross-border interbank payment system to settle the biggest commodity contracts with Russia, Africa, and the Middle East entirely in the yuan currency, which, of course, bypasses the US jurisdiction. India has established rupee Vostro accounts with over 20 partners around the world. This framework allows India to buy discounted Russian oil, also settled in Indian rupees. Brazil has signed a direct currency swap agreement with China as well, which isolates its agricultural export sector from disruption. Saudi Arabia also expanded their geopolitical alliances, and in June 2024, an informal petrodollar agreement with the US has come to an end and has not since been renewed. And this now gives Saudi Arabia essentially a certain flexibility to price the oil in different currencies around the world. United Arab Emirates is also an interesting story because it hosts quite a lot of entities related to sanctioned nations. And so the United Arab Emirates are trying to diversify their trade infrastructure. But of course, with the situation in the Middle East currently being what it is quite unclear where this will lead us. And of course, it would be silly to expect that the US dollar would and will lose its influence in the nearest future or even in the next few decades. However, the active weaponization of that system and the US dollar is forcing the non-aligned nations to build alternative financial systems. And at the moment, it is clear that the international trade system is transitioning from an absolute dollar monopoly to a multipolar system, where regional currencies handle an increasing share of the global commerce. What do you think? Do you think that a more fragmented financial system has the power to make the world more stable? Or do you believe this will lead us to more chaotic trade wars, where inevitably there will be a bigger winner at all times and quite a lot of smaller losers? Please let me know what you think in the comments. If you have an international trade related business and you need any assistance related to international trade, please do not hesitate in contacting me. This video in particular has tackled the topic of sanctions. There are different topics to be considered when it comes to sanctions, and it's related to essentially creating an internal compliance program that will allow your business to avoid sanctions as much as possible and to stay compliant. I will leave my details below the video. In the meantime, thank you for watching and see you next time.